Okay, I think we're connected. Okay, some people are checking in. Hello, greetings to everyone. We'll be starting in a couple minutes. Okay.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. This evening, I'm going to talk a bit about the Buddha to try and uh, get a little closer to this actually rather elusive figure. Everybody has seen Buddha images, Buddha statues. These are not actual representations of what the man looked like. We don't know. No images were made of the Buddha for several hundred years after his passing. So they are rather imaginative. And our picture of the Buddha is often colored by many layers of later embellishment. I think when we're considering the Buddha, we have to try and avoid two extreme positions. As so often in the Dhamma, the middle path is the way. There's a Zen saying, if you've seen the old man Shakyamuni, have you seen the Tathagata? And if you've seen the Tathagata, have you seen the old man Shakyamuni? And this neatly encapsulates the two extreme positions. One is the position of later generations in Asia, particularly in some of the Mahayana schools in India, where the Buddha ceased to be regarded as, in the context of a historical living human being, but was elevated to status of a deity. One of the extreme examples of this was that some Mahayanists in India held the position that the Buddha never actually lived on earth or performed the various actions that are recorded in the canon. It was only an illusion. He was always enlightened from beginningless time, and his manifestation on earth was as a deity sitting on a golden lotus in a pavilion, and for 40 years he uttered a single note continuously, and the only ones who could understand the meaning hidden in that tone were the great arahants who surrounded him. And all the biography that we have of the Buddha was just a fable or a tale that he told hidden in that note. So that's one extreme position. The other extreme is to negate or ignore the transcendental aspects of his attainment. And we see that in some modern attempts to reconstruct the life of the Buddha, and with a materialist bias or a psychologizing bias to reduce him to a kind of wise philosopher and nothing more. If we go back to the original sources, there is actually a paucity of hard biographical details about the Buddha's life before his awakening. There is very little support in the canon itself for the well-known story about Siddhartha Gautama being the son of a king and leaving the palace to seek awakening. It's actually very unlikely that he was a king or Raja, because we do know from other sources that the Sakyans had a republican form of government. So they didn't have kings as such. Now, it is mentioned in the canon when the Buddha is talking about his own life that he was a Kshatriya. He was of the noble caste, the warrior noble caste, and that his family was very wealthy and he was raised in a luxurious environment. So that the stories of his being the son of a king are an exaggeration, but they're probably not far from the actual biographical truth. So the human quality of the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva before his awakening, is hard to put into precise detail, but we can infer the general context. He was a human being who lived at a certain time and a certain place in a certain cultural framework. The Sakyans lived in the northern, at the northern edge of the Indo-Aryan civilization. They were kind of backwoods folks in a way, and were old-fashioned by the standards of the time. Much of the Ganges Valley, which is the heartland of the Indo-Aryan peoples, were moving away from the older republican forms of government into monarchies. But the Sakyans were one of the holdouts. And when we say a republican form of government, you mustn't impose modern ideas of what a republic means onto that. It certainly wouldn't have been democratic in any sense. It was a government of the leaders of the different families or clans. So it was a shared sovereignty rather than one dominant king. And as a kshatriya, or a khattiya in Pali, the young Siddhartha would have been an educated person. These were the nobles, and they were literate and learned, perhaps not to the same degree as the Brahmins, but he also would have been trained in the military skills of riding and shooting and sword fighting and so on. And some of this comes through in the Buddha's parables and analogies. And he talks about training horses and so on. He did come from that milieu. That was his cultural background. And I often remind people that when you are reading the suttas and trying to understand the nuances, to avoid imposing your modern cultural framework onto what the Buddha is saying, and recall that his audience were men and women of that time and place, and their education was different than ours, their presuppositions were different than ours, and that's who the Buddha was speaking to. And a lot of the nuances come through more clearly if you understand that. So the Buddha, during his lifetime, after his awakening, he traveled fairly extensively, but never got too far from the Ganges River. The Ganges Valley was, in later times, was considered the Majjhima Padesa, the middle country. And there's, for example, some Vinaya rules that are different for monks living in the Majjhima Padesa and for monks living outside it, which is the rest of the world. So the geographical extent of the Buddha's wanderings didn't go beyond that heartland of the Indian civilization. So he was very much embedded in that culture and that way of life, that way of thinking. And his awakening is timeless. The Dhamma is timeless. It's not affected by cultural norms, but the exact expression, his way of explaining, was definitely fit within that framework. And the Buddha lived a full life. And this is something that is different from, say, for example, Jesus Christ, whose teaching career was only 3 years. And it was also the Buddha had the merit to be teaching in an environment that was supportive of holy men. So he spent 45 years, and this is one reason why the canon is so extensive, because the record of his discourses spans a long and fruitful, productive life of teaching. He died at the age of 80. So the human side of the Buddha is something that we should keep in mind, that this was a human being, but he was a human being who had attained perfection. And this is the important quality of the Buddha. This is why he's important to us today, is that this was a human being who reached the full human potential. And this is an extremely rare development. In the Theravada tradition, it's said that there is an age or a kappa in which there will be 5 Buddhas altogether, and it's called a fortunate aeon because of that. This 5 Buddhas is the maximum number that can exist within a single aeon. There may be hundreds or thousands of aeons passed by with no Buddhas at all. So the idea is that this extreme rarity of a Buddha emphasizes the special quality of the full awakening. So what Buddha means is awake, which implies that the rest of us are to some degree more or less asleep. And the Buddha was one who fully awoke. And we cannot fully comprehend from our less than fully awakened state, we cannot fully comprehend the mind of a Buddha. This is one of the things the Buddha said that is incomprehensible, is the limits of a Buddha's mental capacity. This extreme rarity of attainment of Buddhahood is again something that other schools of Buddhism have moved away from, to the extreme that there's a saying in Zen that every being is a Buddha from beginningless time. Which in some sense, in a metaphorical sense, I can understand that to mean that this is the potential, consciousness potential, when consciousness is not in any way obstructed or defiled by states of greed, hatred, and delusion. When it's fully manifest freely, it's liberated, then this is the nature of a Buddha, fully awakened, fully liberated, unobstructed by the defilements. There was a debate within Theravada in later times as to whether the Buddha could be said to be omniscient or not. And this is something that the Buddha himself never claimed to be omniscient, but there was a movement, a tendency even within Theravada to elevate the status of a Buddha beyond the human, and they wanted to make him omniscient. And the formula that was finally settled on this, in the commentaries, was that the Buddha was omniscient in the sense that he didn't know everything at once, but he couldn't know anything if he put his mind to it, if he directed his attention to it. Example being the number of fish in the Ganges River. He wouldn't necessarily know that unless he decided for some reason he wanted to, then he could direct his mind to it and know it. This is not something the Buddha himself claimed. This was a later development. But what the Buddha did claim for himself was that, for example, he could remember all his past lives. And he knew that his consciousness was completely unobstructed, completely free from defilements. This is the extinction of the asavas. That was the final realization under the Bodhi tree. The account of the Buddha's awakening that we have from the Vinaya text, the Mahavaga, says that it occurred in three stages, let's say. This is called the three supreme knowledges. The first knowledge of the Buddha occurred in the first watch of the night, when he remembered all his past lives going back many thousands of eons. And then the second watch of the night, he took that from the personal to the general, and he gained a penetration of a deep understanding of the law of karma, and he could observe beings rising and falling in samsara. And he saw that process in a general way. And then in the third watch of the night, and it said that his full awakening occurred at the exact moment when the planet Venus rose above the horizon. He realized the extinction of the asavas, the root defilements, meaning his psyche was cleared to the depth of any trace of delusion or defilement. So this was a tremendous achievement of world historical importance and of extreme rarity. And recall that the Buddha's first impulse after attaining awakening was to just continue to enjoy the bliss of that state and not bother going back into the world and dealing with other beings and trying to teach. He thought this Dhamma of mine is subtle and difficult, and people are attached to their sense pleasures. They won't want to hear it. It'll just be wearisome and vexatious to try and teach. So that was his first inclination, was not to teach. But he was then approached by the Brahma Sahampati, a highly evolved being from the Brahma plane of existence, who manifested on the earth and begged the Buddha on bended knee, out of compassion for those beings who are perishing from not hearing the Dhamma. There are those with little dust in their eyes. So there's right from the start here a kind of more than a hint of an elitist position within Buddhism. It's for those with little dust in their eyes. And the Buddha, out of compassion, consented to rise up from his seat and go forth and teach, and he did so for 45 years. And his motivation for that was entirely compassion. He could have had that option of just staying under the Bodhi tree and not bothering. He certainly wasn't seeking any worldly gain. So these also manifest what are called the two supreme qualities of the Buddha: the wisdom, panya. He had a full, complete understanding, and compassion, karuna. Having gained the understanding, he then became motivated to try and share it and to teach. And his first successful teaching was given to the five ascetics that had been his companions in his wandering days, when he taught the Four Noble Truths. And one of them, Kandanyo, at the conclusion of the Buddha's discourse, Kandanyo said, "Such it is, that which is subject to arising is subject to cessation." Because Kandanyo's Dhamma eye had opened. During the discourse, he had attained stream entry. And it's a detail that may be missed, but his exclamation after the Buddha's talk is interesting, because that was not the theme of the Buddha's talk. The Buddha's talk was about the Four Noble Truths, and Kandanyo's utterance was on the theme of impermanence. So this means that Kandanyo had directly seen and known the Dhamma and was expressing another aspect, that he had independently realized. So the Buddha had, at that moment, had successfully transmitted the teaching. And this moment, Kandanyo's attainment of stream entry, is arguably the more important event historically than the Buddha's own enlightenment. Because the Buddha's own enlightenment was entirely a personal thing up to that point. If the Buddha had decided to stay underneath the tree and just enjoy the bliss of awakening, then we wouldn't have heard of him today. We wouldn't be here this evening talking about him. But he successfully transmitted the teaching to Kandanyo, who was the first of many who attained to awakening after being exposed to the Dhamma, the words of the Dhamma. And it's said that at the moment of Kandanyo's attaining stream entry, all the Devas rejoiced, and the cry went up through the various realms of being that the wheel of the Dhamma has been turned. So this is maybe a third aspect of the Buddha that we need to take into account. First is that they're flesh and blood human beings, Siddhartha Gautama, who was born in Lumbini and raised in Rajagaha, in the Kshatriya class. Second aspect is, as a Buddha, a fully awakened, fully attained, perfected human being who reached the transcendent plane of awareness and awakening, fully liberated, absolute pinnacle of human potential, a transcendent consciousness. The third aspect is the Buddha as a world historical figure, someone who turned the wheel of the Dhamma and affected the whole subsequent history of the earth. The Buddha's teaching is certainly one of the great teachings in the history of the planet, and it's had a tremendous effect on many civilizations and many billions of people. And it's had influences beyond the narrow bounds of its own purview of the Buddhist countries. Other religions and other philosophies have had a a syncretic influence. Probably got into Buddhist ideas, probably got into Christianity somewhat through Alexandria, into the Gospel of St. John, for example. And the fact of the Buddhist teaching still existent today, 25 or 26 centuries later, means that there is a possibility, there is a way for human beings of this generation to realize the Dhamma for themselves and to follow in the footsteps of Anyo Kondanyo, and realize the truth. Well, that way is not yet closed. This is considered to be a Buddha epoch, an age when the Buddhist teachings are existent in the world. It's generally considered that this period is a declining age. You know, the Buddhist teachings have generally been declining, and this is supported by the cosmological vision of cycles of history, the rise and fall. And it also makes some sense that at the moment when the Buddha was existent in the world in flesh and blood and teaching, many beings who had very good karma, had accumulated a lot of merit, would have been born into his presence. And many of them attained to arahantship in that lifetime, and then were removed. You know, they're not coming back into rebirth, and they're not arising again in subsequent times. And as we get further and further from the Buddha, the beings that are born into this world have more attenuated merit. Now, we still have a tremendous amount of merit to be able to be born into a period when the Buddhist teaching is existent, but our merit is not as great as those who were born in the presence of a living Buddha. And the Buddhist teaching is also considered to be, like everything else, is finite in duration. It's impermanent. It will pass away and be forgotten. And there's still in this world, there's still predicted to be one more Buddha yet to come, Meitya Buddha, but probably many thousands of years in the future. That will be the last Buddha of this world age. So we should consider ourselves blessed and fortunate to be existing in a Buddha period when the Buddhist teachings are still known and still taught and can be found, because there are long dark ages in between Buddhas when no one has the light of the Dhamma to guide them. So I'll stop there, and we can see what's going on in the chat. See, did the Buddha go through the 4 stages of enlightenment during his last lifetime? That is kind of a controverted point. The account in the Mahavaga doesn't mention the Buddhas attaining the lesser stages like Sotapanna. It talks in terms of the 3 widgets, so it may be that the unfoldment of a Buddha is different It doesn't go through the four stages. I think the general position that the commentary settled on was that he did go through the four stages, but very quickly, one after the other. Since having a wife and child, one would assume that he had sensual desire. Yes, certainly he did, before his awakening. Or was it different for him being a bodhisattva? No, he had sensual desire, sensuality as a prince, but he was able to put that aside. He was able to rise above that. I thought he grew up in Kapilawatu. Yes, I'm sorry. I think I said Rajagaha. That's incorrect. You're right. Let's see. Is it the Theravada view that the present Bodhisattva Meitya currently resides in the seat of heaven? Yes. The wiki entry for him cites that, yet with no citation or source. Yeah, it is. And there's a. I don't know if there's any mention of that in the canon, but it's certainly in the commentaries that Meitya's existed in Tusita heaven, waiting for his time. Tanajan, what to make of the Dona Sutta in which the Buddha refutes being a god or a human? It seems that Buddhahood inaugurates a new state of being, or entirely beyond being and non-being. Yeah, I think that's generally what you say is correct. This sutta you're referring to, the Buddha was asked by a wanderer shortly after his awakening, when I imagine that the Buddha right after his awakening was probably just glowing, probably very amazing, obviously full of charisma and power. And the wanderer Dona asked him, what are you? Are you a Dewa? No, I'm not a Dewa. Are you human? No, I'm not human. Then what are you? I am Buddha, meaning I am awake. So he transcended the mundane human state. What about the development of cosmic Buddhas like Amitabha? What's the origination of this concept? Well, that's a Mahayana conception that you don't have anything like that in Theravada. These transcendent Buddhas that are still in existence. The Theravada view is that a Buddha, after he attains enlightenment, then this is his last lifetime, and at the end, when he passes into parinibbana, he doesn't arise again in any form. So there are no, in the Theravada conception, there are no Buddhas existent eternally in heaven realms, as there is in some versions of Mahayana. What about Pacceka Buddhas? How many will there be in this age, or can they teach the Dhamma? Pacceka Buddhas are fully awakened beings who arise in dark ages with no Buddhas present. No, the Buddha is a short form for Sammasambuddha, fully enlightened Buddha. Pacceka Buddha is a notch down from that, in that they have the same understanding, but they don't have the capacity or the gift of teaching. And stories about them, they do actually teach in small ways. They can take a few disciples and pass on some meditation, but they don't succeed in getting anyone else enlightened. So they come and go. They're not remembered in subsequent times because they leave no legacy. And it's not traditionally it's not considered possible for a Pacceka Buddha to arise now, for example, because this is a Buddha period. Their Buddha teachings extend. So anyone who attains enlightenment in this age will have followed the Buddha's path and become an arahant. But the Pacceka Buddhas arise in a dark age and they attain enlightenment on their own without being taught. Pacceka Buddhas are Buddhas, but they're not Sammasambuddhas. They're not fully awakened by themselves. And the big difference is they don't have the capacity of teaching sufficiently to get anyone else enlightened. Ajahn, in my personal experience, sometimes shaving my head too often seems like an unpleasant and painful chore, although I see the feeling of renunciation makes me wonder, why is it a big deal? Well, shaving the head is a kind of ritual act. It's actually for a bhikkhu, it's only required in Vinaya that you shave your head at the time of your ordination, but it's traditional for in most circles for the bhikkhus to regularly shave their heads as a kind of renewal of that renunciation. And different groups of bhikkhus will do it on a different schedule. Some will do it once a month. My particular group, we do it once every 2 weeks, and other ones will do it once a week, or some do it daily, just keep the head shaved. The 32 signs of a great man portray the Buddha as having some almost inhuman physical attributes. Should we disregard this as mythos? I don't know. There's no way of knowing that. Like I say, we don't have any real images of the Buddha. And the 32 marks are certainly, some of them are quite bizarre, really. This is also a part of the Indian context, because this is a pre-existing idea that a Mahaparisa, a great man, would have certain unique physical characteristics by which he could be recognized, and the Buddha fit that mold. I have heard one theory that I'm not going to either accept or deny this theory. I'm just throwing it out there as some speculation that I've heard, that some of the Buddha's marks were actually not things he was born with, but peculiarities of physical changes that were induced by his years of austerity. For example, the very long tongue. There is a kind of extreme yoga practice that is known, that some Indian yogis do, to stretch the tongue out to very great length by continually pulling on it, and by cutting that. There's like that, I forget what you call it. There's a name for it. There's a little bit of skin underneath the tongue. They cut that with a razor little by little as they pull out the tongue, and they can make the tongue very long. So that may be that the Buddha did some of those weird practices when he was in his 6 years of asceticism. Knowing that one Metya resides in Tusita heaven, who is the last Buddha of this aeon, many eons can pass with no Buddha, the Bodhisattva vow seems a tremendously ponderous burden. Yes, it is. In Theravada, the Bodhisattva vow is interpreted quite differently than in Mahayana. It means something quite different. Anyone can take a vow to be a bodhisattva, meaning that you're not going to practice for arahantship, but for full Buddhahood, meaning you're postponing stream entry. Because if you become a stream enterer, then you will be fully awakened, become an arahant in 7 lifetimes. That's not enough. That's not nearly enough time to become a Buddha. But on the other hand, if someone makes a vow to be a Buddha, they can always renounce it and say, okay, I'm going to go for stream entry. I'm not going to, this is too hard, until the time when they make it before a living Buddha. And that's the real Bodhisattva vow. This is, I think, at least one meaning of the Buddha's title of the Bhagawa, which means the Blessed One, because he was blessed 92 eons ago by the Buddha Dipankara, when he made a vow before the Buddha Dipankara that I too want to attain Buddhahood, I'll practice for Buddhahood. And Dipankara, with his psychic power, said, yes, this one is destined to become a Buddha. So that was his blessing from a previous Buddha. So there's a kind of a lineage of Buddhas that way. But it is said to be a tremendous sacrifice because it's so much more time. Takes so much more time, many hundreds of lifetimes, aeons really, and it's so much more difficult and painful than the ordinary path to arahantship. Why are Buddhas said to arise in the same location? Is this true? What is the significance of this? Yes, it's said that that spot near Bodh Gaya where the Buddha was enlightened is called the Bodhimanda, and that's the same spot in which every Buddha of this world age will sit and become enlightened. There's a kind of charming story about that. Before the Buddha's awakening, as you're probably all familiar with the story, that the shepherd girl gave him a bowl of milk gruel, and he gave up his fasting and said, "No, this extreme fasting is not helping. I'm going to eat this gruel and then go and meditate." And after he ate the gruel, he took the bowl that it had come in, and he said, "I'm going to put this bowl in the stream." There's a little creek or stream there, and if it floats upstream against the current, it's a sign that I will attain Buddhahood. And he put it in the water, and it floated upstream for some distance and then sank. And when it sank, it fell with a clink onto a pile of 3 other bowls left by the 3 previous Buddhas. And a Naga king who had been alive that whole time was sleeping there. When he heard the clink, he woke up and he said, "Oh, another Buddha has arisen in the world. So soon." It's like thousands of years later. Okay. Since there are most likely alien Buddhas outside this world system, could it be possible for beings from world system in the Dark Age to visit these world systems with Buddhas present? I suppose it's possible. There's a tradition in the commentaries that there can only be one Buddha at a time in a circle of 10,000 worlds. Dasa Sahasa Chakawala, the 10,000 world system. So this is again a development in the Theravada commentaries to always emphasize the rarity, extreme rarity of a Buddha. So there can only be one at a time in a sphere of 10,000 worlds. And sometimes when the Buddha gave a great discourse, it's mentioned that deities from 10,000 world systems would come to hear him preach. So there is mention at least of devas coming from other world systems to hear a Buddha preaching. M.N. Majjhima Nikaya 81, the story about the Buddha in previous life ordaining under Kassapa due to persuasion by a lower caste friend. What is the significance of this sutta? Yeah, it shows one of the past lives of the Buddha. That the Kassapa was a previous Buddha, one of the previous Buddhas, the number 3, the one just before the Gautama. And at that time, he took ordination under Kassapa. And one of the significances of this is that because his friend had first encouraged him to go and see see Kassapa, and he didn't want to listen to this lower caste friend, and he said something disparaging about Kassapa, this kind of this wandering beggar monk. I don't want to listen to him. And because of his making that disparaging remark, that was some bad karma that he made, and that was said to be the reason it took him 6 years of austerities. I mean, in the suttas, it seems very important to Buddhist people to shave their head and go into homelessness. The part about homelessness I understand, but why shave the head? Oh, it's a sign of renunciation, shaving off a hair and beard. It's like maybe maybe it was even more so in Indian culture for a nobleman, particularly, to proud of their appearance, to shave their head would have been a renunciation. The thumbnail I used in for this talk actually was it's a common motif in Asian art. Is the young prince after he left home cutting off his hair with his sword. Are there any special teachings about bodhisattvahood in Theravada tradition? Uh, Only pretty much what I recounted already. And the Jatakas certainly are all stories about the Bodhisattva in his previous births. Yes, wheel turning monarchs. Yeah, I did talk about those previously, and I got a whole chapter on wheel turning monarchs in my book on cosmology. It's kind of a fascinating topic, the wheel turners. The mythical kings who unite the whole earth without stick or sword and rule justly. May I request a reading and explanation of Mahadana like you did for MN49? Okay, I'll keep that in mind as a possibility. That would be a good one. Okay. How does ongoing technological advancement fit the ongoing decay? Part of the problem or just something weird happening? Well, technological development is a two-edged sword. As we develop technologically, we lose innate abilities, and this has been demonstrated many times. And historically, the widespread literacy, people don't have the memory that they used to be able to remember whole epics and things. Now you just have it in a book. Even in my own lifetime, I often cite this as an example. When I was a young man, everybody would have in their mind memorized, a dozen or so phone numbers, and 7-digit phone numbers of your friends and of places you regularly went. Now nobody even, people have a hard time remembering their own phone number because it's all digitized on their phone. They just have to type in the first 2 letters of the name or whatever, and it fills out. They dial it. Would you please elaborate which khandhas are at work to form words and senses and the order of the whole process? Well, that's entirely within the Sankara khandha, and particularly the sankharas of Vitaka and Vichara, which are the sankharas by which we manipulate mental formations. And then it becomes expressed through the sankhara of, I forget the exact Pali, but it means verbal intimation, or verbal communication. So it begins in the mind with manipulating mental formations, handling them and rearranging them, and then is expressed through speech. When the Buddha becomes a Tathagata, was every aspect of who he was a man prior dissolved? All habit, genetic predisposition, prior personality traits? No. No, that's not. There's a this is the old man Sakyamuni and the Tathagata. The the man Siddhartha Gautama was purified and perfected, but he still had that form and even characteristics of bearing and behavior and so on. There's a story that's used to illustrate this is about Sariputta, whose level of attainment was second only to the Buddha in his time. And it's said that this is a story about him that he was on alms round, and they would come to a puddle of water, and all the other monks would walk around the puddle carefully, but Sariputta put his 2 feet together and jumped over the puddle. And one of the novices, seeing this, thought that was misbehavior. It was like unseemly behavior for an elder monk to be doing such a thing, and he reported it to the Buddha, and the Buddha just dismissed it and said, "Oh, that's no reason for concern. That's just his natural predisposition, because at one time he spent 500 subsequent lifetimes as a monkey. Old habits are still there." Are jhana attainments necessary to become a non-returner? Well, the theory in Abhidhamma is that jhana is required for Maggaphala, meaning even to become a stream enterer, one must have jhana. But there's also mention, without explanation, a very brief mention in the canon of the bare insight path of just attaining awakening without prior development of jhana. And the way this has been reconciled in traditions like Mahasi Sayadaw tradition in Burma that emphasize vipassana without jhana is they say that when one reaches a stage of awakening like stream winner or anagami, then there has to be one moment where the mind comes together in perfect samadhi, one moment of jhana, but it might be just a single moment, and then that's sufficient for the mind to then transcend. That would also make some sense in support of that, in that the Abhidhamma talks about the process of awakening as Maggaphala, that's path and fruit. And Magga part means that the 8 path factors come together on the transcendent level. So the path factor of Samma Samadhi would have to be perfected for at least a moment. So one would have the consciousness level of jhana immediately prior to attaining awakening. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up. We've been going for about an hour, and thank you all for attending this week, and we'll see you again.